Our city government has recently made the decision to make it illegal to keep a pit bull as a pet. Many dog enthusiasts are outraged by this decision, and they are insisting that it is not the fault of the breed that there are so many pit bull attacks. They insist that it is bad dog owners who have given the breed a bad name. In a recent community conversation, I made the observation that of all of the deaths from dog attacks that happen every year in America, more than half of them involve a pit bull that does the killing. That fact almost never has the slightest impact on the owners of pit bulls, who insist that their dog is loving and sweet and wouldn't hurt anyone. Thomas Paine, one of the intellectual giants from the early days of our nation, said, "To argue with a person who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead." The hard facts are in. Looked at purely from a mathematical perspective, pit bulls are the most dangerous dogs on the planet. But if you happen to love your own pit bull, that fact is often rendered completely meaningless. Not because the fact is mistaken, but because the owner of the pit bull does not want the fact to be true. To really understand a pit bull owner, you have to ask what owning a pit bull feels like to the owner. What does it do for them? How does having an efficient killing machine in the house make you feel? And in fact, in most cases, it makes a person who is afraid of crime or rape or violence, it makes them feel more secure. Their dog is not likely to attack a member of the family. Dogs are pack animals. They're not going to attack, in most cases, the people that feed them and house them. The neighbor's kids, not so safe. Still, in the overall scheme of things, I really can't believe that I'm saying it this way. I don't mean to be dismissive, but pit bulls only kill about 25 people a year. And in a country of 350 million people, that's statistically pretty small. The fact that most of those 25 people are children does change the dynamic a bit, but still, pit bulls only kill about twice as many people as dairy cows, and no one's announcing a ban on dairy cows. Controversial topics are controversial because there are more than one or two or three legitimately plausible views at play. But when emotions get involved, facts are oftentimes the first casualty. But we're not here to talk about pit bulls today. Today we're talking about guns, which generates more irrational and heated controversy than almost any other topic in America. It has not been uncommon through the years for me and Sean to make a decision to take a service all the way back to ground level and start all over again after there's been a national tragedy. But in spite of the fact that we're gathered today on the heels of the worst mass murder in modern history, that's not why we're talking about gun control today. It's actually coincidental. Today's agenda was set weeks ago, long before the Las Vegas shooting. And not to be flippant about it at all, but you know, for me, mass shootings are not really the real issue here. These incidents get into the news because they're so random and they're so tragic. But I want to have a very sober and a very factual conversation with you today about gun control. And I want to start with the observation that mass murder accounts for only a tiny fraction of the casualties from gun violence in our country every year. We have over 30,000 gun deaths every year, and you see that little slice in the middle is from mass murder. Mass murder is defined as 4 or more people in a single shooting incident. But suicides account for more than half, 62 or 3% most years. Homicides account for most of the rest of it. A few are accidents. And you notice this graph that comes from British news. American news agencies don't talk much about our overall gun problem, but British news agencies talk about us quite a bit because they are baffled by how crazy we are. But you don't see a line item for people who were killed in self-defense because it's statistically insignificant, less than 1%. And yet we say that we buy guns for self-protection, but fewer than 250 a year take place under those circumstances. Now, the CDC is no longer allowed legally to keep records on this. Thankfully, British press is not governed by the CDC. And the NRA sends out magazines every month to their gun owners with absolutely fictional accounts of brave people who saved themselves with their guns. If I could get a grant and had a year or two to study, I would love to go back and research all of their claims of uses of guns in self-defense, because I'm pretty sure that more than 90% of them are completely bogus exaggerations of reality. But I don't want you to let any of these statistics slip by you. I'm glad my preaching professor isn't here, because the use of graphs and statistics in a sermon would have gotten me an F at Vanderbilt, I can tell you right now. But for every person killed in self-defense, when you're using a gun for what you want to use it for, 64 or 65 people commit suicide with a gun. 30 or more are murdered, and several die by accident. Less than 1% of the time when a gun is used in a fatal shooting is it being used for the reason that people said they bought a gun. Now, mass murders get into the news. Mass murders get people interested in the topic, and for a little while, an enraged public calls for action. But we all know the steps to this public dance. We lived through Columbine, Aurora, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Charleston, Dallas, Orlando, and so we pretty well know what's going to happen after Las Vegas. At first, the NRA is relatively silent. Politicians will insist that this is not the time. We need to respect the dead. We need to allow families to grieve. We don't need to turn this into a political event. Someone will sincerely offer suggestions like having a moment of silence, donating blood. A few will even try to nibble at the heels of the gun industry, suggesting that we outlaw the firearms equivalent of pit bulls. Let's go for the military weapons, and as if they miss the point that the number of deaths from those things is minor compared to handguns, which is what's used in most suicides. Now, I think most people really are good. Most people want to be helpful. And so immediately after the shootings in Las Vegas, hundreds of volunteers came forward to donate blood. So many that the hospitals were saying, stop with the blood. Whole blood has a shelf life, and we've got more than we can deal with. Don't distract our technicians and nurses with drawing more blood. We've got all the blood that we could possibly use. But ironically then, Congressman Steve Scalise stepped up and asked for volunteers to donate blood. Scalise, just the week before, had returned to Congress after having barely survived an assassination attempt in June when he was shot while he was playing baseball. He is really lucky to be alive. He is still taking physical therapy, learning how to walk again. He is a victim of gun violence, and yet he is providing cover for the gun lobby, offering this suggestion that people donate blood when he knows good and well that the hospitals in Las Vegas have been screaming, no mas. That's how powerful the gun lobby is in Washington. Even if you have been shot, you can still feel compelled to go out and tell lies to cover for the NRA, because without the NRA's A rating for members of Congress, as well as their political donations, most of them couldn't keep their jobs. Sadly, then, after telling the public we don't need any more blood donations, and then Scalise calls for blood donations, the hospitals had to backtrack and start asking for blood donations for blood that they will throw away, because they're all providing cover. Nevada is a very strong NRA state, so they are just providing cover for the NRA. It tricks gullible people into thinking, if I do something, then I don't have to feel badly about the gun violence. Now, donating blood is usually a good thing to do. That's my arm up there. I donate blood every time I'm allowed to. If I haven't been in a mosquito-infested coast of Central America in the last 12 months, I donate blood every 8 weeks. You should too. It is an easy way with relatively little inconvenience or pain to save a life. If you can legally donate blood, but don't let donating blood become an excuse for not changing gun laws. It's like telling someone that they are in your thoughts and prayers. Folks, thoughts and prayers aren't working. It's not working. We've got to do something. Now, there are 4 common lies that are offered up in defense, intended to shut down any meaningful conversation about gun laws. The first is that gun ownership is a right guaranteed in the Constitution. The second is that guns don't kill people, people kill people. There's a corollary to that, of course, and it goes to mental health, that we'll have people just wag their heads and say, well, this is not a gun problem, this is a mental health problem. The third is that the only way to stop a bad person with a gun is with a good person with a gun, because you can tell the difference, can't you? Gun laws don't work, is the fourth argument. If they did, Chicago and Washington, D.C. would not have such a high murder rate. So with your permission, I'd like to address each of these 4 in cold, clear light of reason. I can tell you that I will try to be brief, but in light of having just promised to do this in an honest and reasonable way, this is not brief, so buckle up. The Second Amendment, which appears in our Bill of Rights, guarantees to our citizens the right to bear arms because that is crucial to maintain a citizen army, a well-regulated militia. Now, if you don't know it, the argument for a well-regulated militia was to be sure that a slave revolt could be put down. The reason the Second Amendment was added to the Constitution was to assure Southern white slave owners that they would be able to keep their black slaves on the farm. So that's what it really means. The Second Amendment was not interpreted to mean that every citizen has a right to own guns for the first 200 years of our nation's history. There was a famous Supreme Court case in the 80s called the Heller case that turned well-regulated militia, keep your black folk on the farm, into an individual's right to own a gun. It was an example of an extreme judicial overreach, but now it's the law of the land. Doesn't have to be proven again unless the Supreme Court is willing to overturn that decision. But the Heller decision did not grant citizens the right to own a tank or a bazooka. The government retains the right to regulate and restrict within reason who can own particular kinds of guns. And that line of what kind of gun you can legally buy has been moving through the years. The NRA shifted in the 1960s from being a hunting and sports organization into a gun rights organization after Martin Luther King, John, and Bobby Kennedy were all assassinated. The Johnson administration started to press for gun control at that time, and gun owners panicked that if the government's going to take away assault rifles, the government might take away all the rest of our guns. And that was the point when the NRA started their irrational fear campaign, saying that if you ever give the government an inch, they'll take a mile. In the most recent mass murder, the domestic terrorists used what is called a bump stock to convert a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic rifle, literally a machine gun. Clearly, if automatic rifles are not legal to own, the ability to buy an inexpensive upgrade that turns your semi-automatic rifle into an automatic rifle shouldn't be legal. But those are the high weeds that the NRA drives us into debating. For the NRA, saying no to anything keeps the camel from getting its nose under the edge of the tent. So they will defend the most indefensible hardware, always leading a paranoid charge against the day when President Johnson or President Carter or President Clinton or Obama will come for our guns. And even though the NRA has said that they're willing to contemplate outlawing bump stocks, they don't want it to be legislation, because if their bought and paid for congressmen actually vote against a gun or vote for a gun regulation, then they're not going to get their A+ rating anymore. So the NRA is asking that the Bureau of Tobacco and Firearms do a policy change about selling bump stocks so that as soon as no one's looking, they can change it back. They don't want it to be legislation. Don't let them trick you. These people are not honest. If they chose to do so, though, Congress could make a rational case to limit gun ownership to a weapon that is appropriate for home defense or hunting. Now, the NRA wouldn't like it, but the Second Amendment does not guarantee anyone the right to buy a military-style weapon or to own armor-piercing ammunition or high-capacity ammunition drums or clips. Amen. The Second Amendment, the second argument I mentioned is that guns don't kill people, people kill people. Yes, true enough. A gun on its own is unlikely to kill anyone. But we've not approached the problem with North Korea with the attitude of nuclear weapons don't kill people, people kill people. We have an awareness that a rogue state in possession of nuclear weapons are more likely to kill people. It is true that people are killed with baseball bats and knives, but you can't kill 60 people from a 32nd story window of a hotel with knives and baseball bats. And yes, people do commit suicide in very many ways, from taking pills, cut their wrists, hanging, falling asleep in your car that's running in the garage. I'm not sure I should say this out loud, but you know, folks, if you just pour bleach and ammonia into a bowl and breathe the fumes, you'll die very quickly. But I can tell you this, in my nearly 40 years of ministry, I've lost 5 parishioners to suicide, and all 5 of them used a gun. Many others have made either suicidal gestures or attempts, but they all had a chance to get medical help, to get counseling, and all the others survived. Self-inflicted gunshots rarely allow a person to either change their mind or to be found in time to be saved. Now, if you're so callous that you don't care about 16,000 people who kill themselves every year with guns, then I wish you'd give me the time to tell you about the 5 people that I knew that died from gunshot wounds by their own hand. Or let me introduce you to the families that have survived the loss of a family member to suicide. Because if you can hear that there are 16,000 to 17,000 people who kill themselves every year with a gun, and that's an acceptable number to you, you need help. You really need to be educated on this topic. Suicide is preventable, but it is much less preventable if there's a gun in the house. I mentioned that the corollary to this one is the claim that we don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem. And I've got a couple of things I really need to say about that. On the one hand, there's a certain truth to it. There are about 400 million guns in the United States, which is about half of all the guns in the world. Only a third of Americans own guns. And so if you do the math, you got to realize that there's a handful of people that own a whole lot of guns. We have more than twice as many guns per capita as any other nation in the world. And the other nations that have half as many as we do would kind of surprise you because they're sketchy, violent countries. But countries that have a lot of guns oftentimes have almost no gun deaths. Hunting is very much a part of the culture in Canada, Denmark, and Finland. They just have a very low incidence of gun-related death. You can reasonably say that there is something wrong with Americans. Canadians have about a third as many guns as we have per capita. But in the United States, we have 200 times as many gun deaths as they have in Canada. They have mental illness in Canada. You know some Canadians that you wonder about. But they just don't have the mass murders. They don't have the domestic killing that we have. So yes, something is wrong with us. But as in the most recent event in Las Vegas, there's no way to tell which white guy with a lot of guns is any more likely to shoot 500 people than any of the white guys I know here in the Ozarks that have an arsenal in their homes. There's no way to know which person is going to express their depression or cope with their bankruptcy, their divorce, or miserable home life by shooting up a theater or a nightclub, a school, or a concert. The only part of this we can even begin to control are the weapons and the ammunition. As our friend Dr. Paul Tomlinson has mentioned recently from this pulpit, the mentally ill are much more likely to be the victim of violence than they are to be the perpetrators of violence. Blaming mental illness is just another deception that is used to shut down gun control conversations. Amen. In fact, in the absolute height of hypocrisy, Speaker Paul Ryan trotted out this old saw within 48 hours of the shooting in Las Vegas. And yet earlier this year, Paul Ryan marshaled legislation through the House to remove restrictions against the mentally ill from being able to buy guns. Trump signed that legislation in February, one of the only pieces of legislation that he has passed in his administration. And they then immediately went to work trying to make it legal to buy silencers. One of Donald Trump's own sons made the TV commercials to advocate for legalizing silencers. And yet Paul Ryan comes out in front of the TV camera saying, this isn't a gun incident, this is a mental health incident. Now, I really do want this conversation to be rational and factual and calm, but there's just no way around calling out Paul Ryan for this massive attempt to deceive the people of the United States of America. The Speaker of the House of Representatives has lied to us again. If you believe there's a shortage of treatment for mental illness in this country, amen, I agree. Put more money into mental health, but don't put more guns in the hands of people with serious and persistent mental illnesses. That would be, forgive me for saying it this way because we're not supposed to say it, but that would be crazy. The third argument we hear raised this week is that the answer to gun violence is more guns. Good guys should be armed to stop bad guys who are armed. It's like going to an AA meeting and saying the solution to alcoholism is to drink more. The majority of gun deaths are suicides, so the chances of death from a suicide attempt are much smaller if there is no gun present. Another of the top categories is domestic violence. And as tragic as the death toll was in Las Vegas, there are that many women shot and killed by their husbands or boyfriends every month. In September, there were more than 50 women shot by their domestic partner. That many were killed also in August and July and June and May and April, March, February, January. More than 50 women are shot and killed by their husband or boyfriend every month. There's a lot of domestic violence in our country, but if there is a gun in the house, the woman is 5 times more likely to be killed. A woman who buys a gun to protect herself is more likely to be killed by that gun than she is to be able to successfully use it to defend herself. Some estimates are as high as 17 times more likely. If a woman pulls a gun to defend herself, she is 17 times more likely to die. Now, we're talking about math. One of the things to love about math is numbers don't care what your opinion is. Numbers don't care what you believe. Every woman I know that owns a gun says, well, it wouldn't happen to me. I know how to use it. I'd be willing to fire it. But the math says you are 1,700% more likely to die if you own a gun. And the math is that 50 more women will be killed in November and 50 more in December until we find the will to change the way we are. Finally, the fourth argument claims that gun control laws don't work. Just look at Chicago and Washington, D.C., and yeah, Chicago and Washington, D.C. are not good examples of successful gun control law. The gun laws in Chicago and Washington have hardly had an impact. But folks, here in Missouri, It is not legal to sell alcohol within 100 feet of a church or a school. Has that kept you all from drinking? A city's gun laws hardly matter to anyone who has a car or who is capable of taking a train or a bus out of town. Gun laws do work on a national level. They work in Canada, they work in the United Kingdom, in Denmark, Japan, Germany, New Zealand, in Australia, following a mass murder in Port Arthur on April 28, 1996. In just 12 days after that mass shooting at Port Arthur, 12 days, less than 2 weeks, legislators had passed sweeping gun control laws, and the government instituted a massive buyback program that netted over 1 million guns. Prior to that, Australia had averaged a mass murder every year. 21 years later, there have been none. It works. Gun control laws work. Now, people in Australia didn't like it. They had a gun culture that, if anything, was more devoted than ours. Many of the legislators who enacted these strict gun laws were not reelected. They knew that they were falling on their political sword, but they did what was right to protect Australians. Now, folks, in your wildest dreams, can you imagine Paul Ryan doing that? Can you imagine Mitch McConnell doing? Can you imagine Donald Trump doing what is right, even if they knew that it would cost them their next election? Yes, there's something wrong with Americans, and primarily what's wrong is we need to be more like Australians. We need politicians like they had in Australia. Usually when there's been a mass murder, I go the next morning to the Bass Pro Shop and hang out at their gun counter just to see who all comes in to buy guns in the predictable rush after a mass murder. I didn't go this week. I was just too sick about what happened in Las Vegas. But I know from news reports that the manufacturer has run out of bump stocks even after the price online went up by 10 times. They were $50 and now they're selling for over $500. There's been a predictable rise in gun manufacturer stock on the stock market. Monday morning, stock market had been trending down for days and then suddenly turned around on Monday morning. Massive increase in the sales of hardware and ammunition. A part of that is the fear that there'll be changes in gun laws, even though those changes in gun laws never seem to materialize. But when I began today, I posed the question, how does owning a pit bull make the owner of the pit bull feel? We have to be willing to ask the same question about gun owners. When they go to the store and buy a semi-automatic rifle and armor-piercing ammunition and a bump stock, how does it make them feel? When people go to gun ranges, and there have been interviews, and you can see some of these on YouTube, they ask people, how did it feel to fire 100 rounds in less than a minute? How did it feel? They report that it felt exciting, that it was, one woman even said, rewarding. It made them feel powerful. Is that because they made dozens of holes in a paper target? Or was it because they were fantasizing while firing that gun about how many people that they could kill? How does it feel to own several military-style weapons? Do you think any of these repressed, fearful gun collectors who watch the same news that we watched, 500 injured, 59 dead, how many of them do you think thought to themselves, I could do better than that? That's a part of the problem with announcing that this was the largest or the worst or the most deadly, because for a portion of the NRA crowd, that's a challenge. This shooter didn't even take all of his guns and ammo to that hotel room. He even had a stockpile of explosives and a fairly elaborate escape plan. He meant to do more. This was supposed to be his first attack. Part of the problem with giving these monsters a name and news coverage is that every part of their plan then becomes a lesson plan and a challenge. their death becomes an object lesson for future murderers. Folks, as with so many other of the modern challenges we've looked at these past few months, there is a simple, evident, and obvious solution to the carnage we see every year in America. Every other developed nation in the world has taken steps that we have refused to take. It's not the 59 people who died last week in Las Vegas, or the 50 women who will die next month in their own homes. It is the very predictable 32,000 people who will needlessly die next year if we don't muster the political will to do what is right, what is obvious, and what is necessary. Amen. There's 7 or 8 gunshot deaths in Japan every year. The Japanese are not better than we are. There's rarely more than a dozen in the UK or Denmark. They're not better than we are. They've just got better legislation. No more thoughts and prayers for me. No more asking for forgiveness. No more holding memorials or suggesting that a blood drive is an answer to a mass shooting. This is a problem that can be solved, and there is nothing but moral shame in store for us if we don't get it done. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.